Good evening, everyone. Delighted that you're here. I'm Sharon Pratt, the founding director of the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, but obviously now someone who's in the digital media program. Is this on now? Okay. We're very much delighted to have you with us this evening, both those of you who are here, as well as those of you who are in our virtual audience this evening. Again, as I said, I am Sharon Pratt. I'm with IPPH, and tonight we will be exploring the role that the law has played in advancing the interests of marginalized communities. And with me is Professor Will Thomas, who's with the University of Nebraska, and he is the lead player on a Andrew Mellon initiative around race and the law. And he has done a brilliant job, and he has involved IPPH. We have with us as well Rohulamin Quander. Rohulamin Quander is someone I've known just about most of my life. And Ro Quander is also a resident fellow with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, and he has an extraordinary family history. They're rather litigious. They were very, very clear about leveraging the law to achieve racial justice. We also have with us this evening Professor Adam Rothman with Georgetown University, which is the very first university here in the District of Columbia. And he is leading an initiative there at Georgetown University that talks about the role that Georgetown had and around this issue of race and law, and as it impacted and involved with Georgetown University. Before we get into the essence of the program is to talk to you and share with you examples of how particularly the Quander family, but also Professor Rothman will elaborate as well about experiences they've uncovered at Georgetown University. As we get into the essence of it, before that, I think it's important that we turn to Professor Will Thomas to explain to us about this entire initiative that has been blessed and supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor Pratt. And it's wonderful to see you all. Thank you for being here tonight. The Mellon Foundation has supported this major initiative to research and teach about and do community storytelling around U.S. law and race, the relationship between American law and race and racialization through the law in American history. And so there are really three things that we're working on. One is new courses to be taught at the university and college level around the United States. We're starting at the University of Nebraska with a freshman course that we've titled And Justice for All. And it documents and deals with the United States' history of race and its relationship to law and American constitutionalism. The second initiative that's a part of this larger effort is around research. And we are working to research unpublished, old legal cases that are in the archives. And there may be very many here in DC that we will uncover, we hope, in the archives, to bring those cases to light, to share those with our students, to share those with researchers, and to share those with the descendants of those who were involved in those cases. And so that research initiative is underway. We have graduate students working with us each summer for the next 3 summers, in fact, working on researching cases in American history that have never been published. And really, many of them have never been out of the archives. This is the first they've seen the light of day since they maybe were tried in the 19th century. And the third part of the initiative is around community storytelling, what we're doing tonight as we focus on the Quander family. And so our partner here in the District of Columbia is the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History, headed by Mayor Pratt, and we're very grateful for that partnership, which we have for the next 2 years. It's a 2-year initiative, and we're excited about the conversations that we'll have. All of the material that we are collecting, all of the cases and much of the media that we produce will be available on what is called an open educational resource, an OER, digitally available to every college, to Georgetown, as well as to the University of the District of Columbia, and every school in the United States. So we want to make this material accessible and available for teaching and research and genealogy, of course, as well. So that's what the initiative's about, Mayor Pratt, and I appreciate our partnership.
Right, as do we, very much so. And, I want to begin with a question that I'm going to put to Judge Quander. Of course, I've always called him Ro all my life. And Professor Rothman, I'm calling him Adam if he doesn't mind.
I don't mind.
And first, I should mention that the University of the District of Columbia will become the home again of the DC archives. That's going to make a big difference. It's all consolidated. It'll be right here at the University of the District of Columbia, which does an excellent job, really, of trying to chronicle the history, which has been an overlooked history about Washington, D.C., why it is that we became the capital, and the impact of the reason why we became the capital upon the evolution of the nation's capital and its repercussions of that for the country. But I want to begin with this question and I'll begin with you, Ro, and then ask Adam. What is so interesting about this program is studying how the law helped achieve racial parity. But of course, we also know it was the law that had everything to do with why there was disparity. It was the United States Constitution that extended the life of the Atlantic slave trade, that talked about 3/5 human being for purposes of really representation in the Electoral College and Congress and so forth, and left women completely out as well. So it's almost surprising that anyone would have the gumption and enterprise to leverage the law, especially in the 19th century, as a way to achieve racial justice. Do you have a sense of why your family had that kind of gumption and enterprise?
Good evening. First of all, I want to, as we talk today, I'm going to focus on 2 particular cases, but I want to mention the first documented record we found of court is 1702. So that sets, even though it was unsuccessful, it set a legacy. And I'm not sure that those who came after 1702 knew about the 1702 case, but the family started out asserting what they felt, those who were free, we had free and slave, asserting certain claim of right, claim of privilege that was consistently denied because the assumption was that blacks were enslaved and had no rights. But the first ones, we have a couple branches of the family, they didn't know that or accept that. And what they did, even though it was unsuccessful in terms of winning their case, it was an inspiration for my generation and those who came a little before me to find it, to be inspired by it, and subsequently to say subconsciously and consciously that we are Americans and this is something we have to do for ourselves. And we worked consistently through the decades and the centuries to uplift ourselves and especially to bring some others with us as we went. And I think that as we get a little further in this evening, we'll talk about Negro Harry Quando, in his case against slavery and seeking freedom. And we'll also talk about post-emancipation Felix Quander, born free, but trying to access the law. And every step he took was buffeted by court and then newspapers, and then the use of such racial language that made it virtually impossible to get justice. But they, in both cases, did not give up. And I'll have a chance to talk about that in a little more detail later.
So Adam, as you sort of look at examples of these issues, and particularly in terms of its relationship to Georgetown University, and of course, we know Georgetown has been forthright about its own conflicted history. Was Washington, D.C. a better place? Because, you know, Washington, D.C. is the South. People always know that when they hear me talk. It is the South. It was chosen because it was the capital, because it's the South. Was it a better venue for asserting these kinds of rights than, let's say, Virginia or Maryland? I'm here.
Thanks for that question. And I just want to say I'm really happy to be here as part of this conversation. So thanks to you, thanks to Professor Thomas. And I really I love hearing Judge Quander talk about his family history. It reminds me so much of some of the family histories that we've been able to uncover and engage with as we look more deeply into Georgetown's own history. And in particular, I'll just give you a little bit of context, okay, and then talk about one family that I think is quite relevant here and similar in a way to the Quanders. So the context is I teach at Georgetown, and I'm a historian of slavery. And basically in 2015, Georgetown launched a project to carefully investigate its own historical relationship with slavery. And that experience has really changed my life. It's changed what I research and what I teach and how I teach it. And in part because I think it's such an important and revealing history with a lot of surprising dimensions to it. Now, it's probably not that surprising that Georgetown was founded by the Catholic slaveholding elite of the Chesapeake, and they stamped Georgetown really in their own image in a lot of ways that we could talk about. But what I really want to talk about are some of the people who were held in bondage by the Jesuit priests who founded Georgetown. So in 1791, a person named Edward Queen goes to court to petition for his freedom. And in his petition, he asserts that he is held in bondage by a Catholic clergyman named John Ashton. John Ashton was the manager of a big plantation in Maryland. He also happened to be part of the Catholic clergy that were the founding trustees of Georgetown. So here is an enslaved person, Edward Queen, who's suing a very powerful man connected to the church and the elites for his freedom. So that's a remarkable thing. And even more remarkable, I think, is the basis for the claim, which we could talk about. But he says in this petition, or the petition says, that he is the son of a woman named Phyllis, who is the daughter of a woman named Mary Queen, also known as Queen Mary, who is a free woman. And that's the basis for his claim to freedom. So every society has its rules, even slave societies. And one of the most important rules in a slave society has to do with who can lawfully be enslaved. And in colonial America, the basic rule was that your status followed your mother. If your mother was a free person, you would be free. If your mother was enslaved, you would be enslaved. That was the rule that really enforced slavery in colonial America and the United States. But what's so fascinating about this case is that Edward Queen is taking this rule that fixes slave status on people and is trying to use it to win his own freedom. So I think it's an amazing example of how people try to use, even enslaved people, try to use the rules and the laws to their own benefit, even in cases like this, to get free. So there's lots of complexities we could talk about, but that's the story in a nutshell.
Yeah, we got to probe that one. That's fascinating. Ro, but did it make a difference whether it was a local court, federal court, in terms of pursuing these kinds of claims?
Well, that's a very interesting question because when Negro Harry Quander, let's back up, a Margaret Claggett, her will was dedicated December 29th, 1823. And in it, she provided for the freedom of two of her enslaved women and their children. But she didn't use the word free. She released them. And she said that Harry, which we think it's hard to read the writing, some say it's Harry, some say it's Henry, he used to work for a year and half of the proceeds were to go to Maria. And we think Maria might have been his common law wife. Didn't say free for him. So when Miss Claggett died, we don't know the date, about 1824, he waited. And it wasn't until 1830 that the case got to court. So frustration, anger, actually not having any rights that he could put a pen in and stick a pen or pencil. I'm sure he was very angry. And the thing about it that's so enlightening that a man who has seemingly no rights would take a chance. Because if he lost that suit, he could have been sold south or any punishment worse than anything he'd endured, an extra 5 years enslavement. But he stepped forward. Now, we don't know how he secured counsel. But Francis Scott Key, January the 4th, 1830, filed a petition for freedom, and recognizing that this was going to probably be a significant case, the Claggett family retained William Marbury of Marbury versus Madison. I had to check to make sure it was the same person. So here you have an enslaved man from the Claggett family with Francis Scott Key as counsel, and the Claggett family being represented by William Marbury, who was saying repeatedly this was a bad precedent because there's no word for freedom in this will. Judge Cranch, who happened to be President John Quincy Adams' nephew, John Adams' nephew and John Quincy Adams' first cousin, looked at the totality, and he said that was the intent based on the totality of the circumstance. So he looked at the law. Judge Cranch did, I'm sure he did, I wasn't there, and he saw that manumission by will could be recognized in Maryland. And the question is, how did it come into the district when they were in Maryland the whole time? Now, I don't know whether they decided there was an opportunity or maybe over the time Harry might have been in Washington. But it is an interesting question that this all took place in Maryland. How did it get into Washington, D.C.? But I assume once they figured out that there could be some jurisdiction in Washington, it was better to bring it in the capital city. And Judge Cranch, being the chief judge and also an abolitionist, I understand, was a favorable outcome and a favorable venue, but it could have gone another way. And he could have certainly suffered the consequences, but did not. The regret we have, though, there may have been a lot of backstory. I wanted to find out what happened to him afterwards, and I retained the services of a professional genealogical historian. They had not been able to find him, so they notified me. They only think of only two likely things. He was about 40, 41 years of age. He may have died shortly thereafter, or he may have left the area and changed his name. So we have not been able to find him, but we've been inspired by the case because of the significance of what it does, not just for the Quander family, but for manumission by will and being able to target and challenge such high-powered people like the Claggets, who were some of the first families of Maryland, and be successful. And that's been an inspiration to our family now for centuries.
Well, what I wanted to ask you about, Will, if I could, is as you look at this broad topic, to what extent people were at risk in terms of violence, and to what extent you needed somebody. I assume Francis Scott Key, we know he did wrote the Star Spangled Banner, but was he a person of real stature in the community, which would help you be seriously, to take your case seriously?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. There were risks, substantial risks to any enslaved person who filed a freedom suit. Probably the most significant risk is that they would, even before they could file the freedom suit, that they might be sold south, as Judge Quander just mentioned, or that there might be retaliation from a slaveholder right then and there, the minute they learned of this. So there's no doubt that once a case was filed with the court essentially directed the slaveholders and the attorneys that the person shall not be taken out of the jurisdiction of the court, right? So until the matter is resolved, the person who filed the freedom suit would be, to a degree, protected from the worst of the slave trade, for example. But I think in general, looking at hundreds of freedom suits in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland and Prince George's County and Anne Arundel and Charles and St. Mary's, there were tremendous risks. And so enslaved people who brought freedom suits did so with deep legal knowledge of what was happening. Harry Quando, we can imagine, knew the law, knew how the law operated, how to find white witnesses who might testify on his behalf. Others did, and I expect that Harry Quando did as well. He also knew how to find Francis Scott Key, a prominent attorney in the district, with roots in Maryland and deep connections and ties. Key represented more than 100 enslaved petitioners for freedom. Later in his career, he disavows all of that work. However, we might get to that. But he, and right about the time actually that Harry Quando is suing for his freedom, Key and other attorneys in the District of Columbia represented enslaved petitioners. There were a handful of attorneys who did not, who just didn't represent any enslaved people. But Key and others did, James Morsell and others, Joseph Bradley prominently, later in the 1840s and 50s. So,
How about Blair?
well, Blair represents
House.
Dred Scott
Yeah.
later,
Yeah.
but no, he's not actually
He's
practicing at law in D.C. Walter Jones and others are at the bar in D.C. Key among the most prominent.
So to what extent is the Catholic Church itself entangled in this dynamic?
Yeah, it's enormously entangled. I just want to add that Key was involved in some of the cases involving Georgetown and the Jesuit clergy as well. So he's a connecting link in all of these in these cases. And it is important to understand that there were many of these cases. It's not just Harry Quando and Edward Queen. There were hundreds of these cases involving dozens of families. And I think in many cases, it is the enslaved families, those family ties, the strength of those families pushing those cases forward in court, seeking allies among the white elite, among the legal community, to see if they can find help. And I think this is especially true. This is an especially powerful phenomenon in the years of the early republic, coming out of the American Revolution, what the historian Ira Berlin calls the revolutionary generation, because there's an opening there where slavery gets called into question, particularly in the Chesapeake, where white elite opinion is quite divided. Even people like Jefferson are kind of internally divided over the justice of slavery, and so there are movements towards manumission, towards gradual emancipation. But there's a kind of opening that I think is part of the context for these freedom suits. The Catholic Church has a kind of interesting situation in all of this, because particularly in Maryland, there was a very strong Catholic community. Maryland was famously founded by English Catholic settlers. But from a very early period, at least by the middle of the 1700s, the strength and prestige of the Catholic community in the Chesapeake rests in part on the wealth that they derive from slavery.
Yeah.
And that's the group that I mentioned earlier that found Georgetown University, the Catholic slaveholding elite. And they had made their peace with slavery. They made their theological peace with slavery over centuries of participation in the Atlantic slave economy. So that by the end of the 1700s, early 1800s, most Catholics believed, most white Catholics believed, that slavery was justified as a Christianizing institution. That partly meant that Catholic slave owners, especially the clergy who owned slaves like the Jesuits, brought the people they owned into the Catholic religious community. You can find the names of enslaved people in baptismal records, marriage records, and burial records. And you can actually find the names of some of the enslaved people involved in these freedom suits in the sacramental records of the Catholic Church. So the church, the clergy, and the parishioners were deeply involved in the slave society of the Chesapeake, and that's the history that we're confronting at Georgetown and other Catholic institutions in the area and across the United States as well.
It's fascinating. I do want to acknowledge that we have our interim academic advisor for the University of District of Columbia with us, Dr. April Massey. We're delighted to have you with us. Again, we are so pleased that the DC Archives is going to be housed here at the University of District of Columbia. As you can tell, I'm ecstatic about that. And so when the family, as you could discern, decided to assert a claim, did they have a greater clarity than most about did they learned about the last will and testament of Claggett, and therefore felt they would they have standing? I mean, would they have standing?
Well, yes, because although there's not much record on the case Quander v. Claggett, the little record that does exist says that Negro Harry Quander asserted that he was a free man, and that came up in the record that Judge Cranch had it. And part of the support for that is that Rhoda and her increase, which is children, and Maria and her increase, who we think was his common law wife, they were now gone. It took a little while, but they had been released in 1827. So here it is that Negro Harry is the only one left back. So he is asserting that under the same document of manumission, I am entitled to my freedom. And eventually the court agreed. One thing Adam said that I want to point out, the phenomenon of us who are Southern Maryland colored Catholics, we are still here. I went to John Carroll, and when I went to John Carroll, it was early on, the schools were just integrated here. We were almost all related. We were, and we came from St. Mary's, Charles, and Prince George's County. And we were just connected. If we weren't related by blood, we were related by marriage. If we weren't related by blood and marriage, we were related by reason of Catholic Youth Organization, colored division, and we knew each other. That was a very strong bond when I went to Carroll in 1957. And we still have it. My class, the black guys, we get together once a year, and we still are celebrating our Catholicness. Everybody's not as active as before, but that bond is still here.
Well, I've noticed that Catholic network that no, I have. If you, it definitely is a network that's still very much alive here in the District of Columbia. But we speak of it, this experience of asserting one's legal rights in terms of during slavery or during that, but post-slavery. In some ways, America became even more intent about maintaining this racial caste system because the fear of freedom. So how did that, have you seen any evidence of that, Will? And what?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we should ask Judge Quander about Felix Quander and his history of legal action, because what's remarkable about the Quander family is there are many things remarkable about the Quander family, but the legal records that we still have that are in the archives of Quando family members suing for freedom in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and then using the law after the Civil War as well to defend their freedom in the face of unrelenting violence right here in Fairfax County, Virginia, where the Felix Quander's family is attacked and brutalized by a vigilante police constable and a posse of 35 white men who attacked their home.
Yeah, that's very true. Felix Quander was born free because he was Nancy Carter Quander and Charles Quander's great-grandson. And Nancy Carter Quander was freed by George Washington under his will. But the issue with Felix Quander, I like to say he was a bit rough around the edges. I didn't know him, of course. But his mark was post emancipation, and his mark was post the passing of obviously the 14th and the 15th Amendments. And the 14th Amendment was a guarantee, number one, of citizenship, and number two, equal protection of the right of the law, excuse me. And he was determined to exercise and access all of that. Now, when I refer to him as a little rough around the edges, we didn't all go to Ivy League school. Maybe some of us didn't go to any school. But he was a farmer. He had property. He had one instance where his horse wandered off, and he went on the property to get the horse. He says the horse was his. He owned it for 6 years. He had another incident where his wife, Julia, and son, Felix Jr., were going to market, coming into the district from Alexandria, Fairfax County, with chickens, and somebody accused them of stealing the chickens. They went to court. The court ruled there was not any evidence to support such a finding. So the man who lost sued him in the district. He then went into Virginia, sued all over again. And when Felix was resisting on behalf of his wife and son, they got into an argument, and the argument became a fight. And then Felix ended up, they couldn't prove it on the chickens, but he was sent to jail for a year for assault and battery. So here it is, the man is trying to stand up to protect his rights and assert it. We don't know the nature of the argument other than the fact that it became one. But there are other incidents where the family was every turn they took, and I'm sure it's happening to other people too. But that particular incident about the chicken, particularly chickens and cows, and horse, being sentenced and objecting, and then Felix ran away because he was going to be given 39 lashes, which is the maximum corporal punishment that they were administering, especially to black people. We have a lot of that in our record, 39 lashes, 4 or 5 cases of it. He ran off, and they ran after him, and they captured him. And he ended up in jail, a big shot in the leg. And this whole miscarriage of justice in the racial context started out in the Alexandria Gazette, and they kept putting it in. But then the Washington Republican, the National Republican, both picked it up. And before we knew it, it was published in, forget some states, Vermont, Iowa, Nebraska.
In German.
It was even in German. Yes.
German.
Yeah, it was in German. So he wasn't able to get justice. And I don't use the N word, but some of this talked about him, a colored desperado, the criminal N word,
Right.
and all of this. But he persevered. He never gave up, and we never gave up. He died in 1903, presumably in his own bed, on what is now Quander Street. Because they came in here, we don't know, we checked with the city council, they couldn't find a naming of the street through action, but there were alleys, and it said black people put their names on the alleys. So we were there in 1890. So Quander Street in 1890 grew out of that determination. And today there are 4 Quander Streets: Quander Road in Fairfax, Quander's Promise over here in Prince George's, and Quander's Lane in Prince William. That's an example of the focus and the determination that we psychologically are very proud of ourselves, but we're very special, at least I try to be, and they too, to realize that we are not special in the sense of thinking we're somebody else. We are special in terms of thinking how we can help other people do something for themselves. And that's why it's so important for us to understand the history of how our people came through the slavery and emancipation after that, and Jim Crow and the civil rights movement, and now to the point where we are getting almost to the 250th anniversary, where we, the people, is everybody, and all men are created equal, means women and people of color.
Well, some people have to read that history. I don't think they know it. But to the credit of the Quanders, that's probably why you're able to document the family history. What is it, back to 1684, which is extraordinary. And part of it is because you created a written record, if nothing else, through the court system.
Yeah, that's true.
But as we talk about racial parity, I want to ask Professor Rothman this. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan came to life post the end of the Civil War, and the end of, as they were ending Reconstruction. And that's, that was a principal focus of Ulysses S. Grant. So, it's not as if official slavery ended, but, a real nightmare began in terms of, it's beyond Jim Crow. It was a really awful time. So how does the justice system work then, or is anything remotely, can you call it justice system then?
Yeah, that's a great question. Can you call it a justice system now? Justice might not be the right word for it. I think that it is really important. Well, first of all, I just want to echo something that Quander said, which is it is really important to know and understand this history. And as somebody who teaches history, history is under attack these days. There are people who don't want us teaching this stuff, but it's really important to get the word out there so that these stories are not lost, and that they don't just sit in the archives. And that's one reason why I think Professor Thomas's efforts with the Mellon Foundation and the reforms to the DC archive are so important to make the original historical material accessible so that we can teach. That's really important. But one thing about the history is that the civil rights movement, or at least the struggle for civil rights, goes back a long way, much longer than a lot of people think. Sometimes in high school, you're taught that the civil rights movement starts in the 1950s. Well, you hear from Judge Quander that the Quanders are fighting for their rights in the 19th century and even before that. So the struggle for civil rights goes back a long time. And it's part and parcel, at least among African Americans, of the struggle against slavery. Because, and again, back to something Judge Quander said about Felix Quander being born free. It's at the moment of emancipation in the District of Columbia, April of 1862, most black people in the district were actually already free. People don't really know that. And they had been fighting for their rights as free people for quite a long time, as the 500,000 free black people in the United States had been doing. And one of the things they had been fighting for was justice in the court system, and especially the right to bear witness. Because in the legal system in the 19th century, black people could not testify in court against white people. And that was a debilitating condition for anybody who wanted to get justice. So one of the key claims that black activists for civil rights in the 19th century are demanding is the right to be able to be a witness against white people in court. And that's something they fight for coming out of emancipation, during Reconstruction, especially under the 14th Amendment. And so there is a kind of legal revolution that comes with emancipation, and the right to testify in court is one of those things. But then, of course, the Klan is part of the backlash against that revolution, the attempt to shore up white supremacy in the face of this wave of emancipation that comes in the wake of the Civil War. So all I really want to say here is that these battles have been going on for a long time, and one focal point for the struggle for civil rights has been the courts.
Well, when I think of the jurisprudential system of this country, in many ways, I mean, it was designed to protect the status quo, would you not say, as against to disrupt that status quo. But then we saw a kernel of enterprise with the Warren Court. I wonder, how did that happen? I mean, he was appointed, was it not, by Eisenhower? I mean, it was pretty much a Republican court. And it was a unanimous vote with Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. How did we go from being this very protect the status quo court to that court? Of course, we're now back to another court, but how do you think that came about?
Well, I think it's has a lot to do with broader change in American life. And it has a lot to do with the persistence of Black Americans to claim rights through and under the law. And in the case of Brown v. Board of Education, those cases have a long and deep history of National Association for the Advancement of Colored People litigation from the 1930s through the 1940s, and a broader sensibility in the court of course, related to the United States position in the world, and certainly Earl Warren as a very attentive political figure, as a governor of California. Most of our Supreme Court justices today are academics or coming out of law school. Those justices on that court were far more politically minded in the broadest sense, understanding where is the United States in the world, and where is the politics of this society going toward democracy. And so I think there are a lot of explanations, but certainly the U.S. after World War II, the expectations of the U.S. after World War II, and crucially, the deep continued legal action of Black Americans that we're hearing extends from the 18th and 19th century, but certainly in the case of school desegregation, it was Black families who brought those cases. It was Black families and Black teachers who sued for equal teacher pay in the whole equalization suits in the 1930s. So that cumulative effect is coming before the court in the 1950s.
No, I think that's from where I sit, a great observation. I'd forgotten that he was governor, but there's a little question also the role of television. I mean, coming out of the World War II, we were great heroes of that war. And then for the world to see how we were treating our own citizens, to see how we assaulted children, essentially, who tried to get a better and have more opportunity in their education. America had to be embarrassed. She had been a great star on the world stage, and now it was revealed her inconsistencies. And your point's well taken. We now have justices who are not as sensitive, or who may not be as attuned to that ecosystem in the same way. Your thoughts on it, Ro?
I think you're absolutely right. this has been an evolution. It should be a revolution, but it's been an evolution. And I think as more and more African Americans have come into positions of visibility, aided by the networks of communication, because we have more people of color, not just African Americans, more people of color in places of leadership and decision making, we can access things that were denied to us before. And men like Charles Hamilton Houston, I grew up with Charlie. He was my buddy, went to his funeral. And I'm talking about the son, not the father. I talked to Charlie. I had a long talk with him when we observed the something at Howard Law School. I said, what did your father die from? Because he was only 7. He said, my father worked himself to death. He said, my mother said my father could not close his eyes, could not go to sleep because he was always working on something. And it's because of men like Charles Hamilton Houston that we got Thurgood Marshall, we got Oliver Hill, we have Kamala Harris, we have Ketanji Brown Jackson, we have Sharon Pratt. Because as we became more aware and accessed what the 14th Amendment promised, but was being obstacled, if you want to call it that, equal protection of the law also gives you equal protection of access to enforce the law. So that's how we got to go to great law schools like our own Howard University. I won't put down Harvard or Yale or any of those places, but we put ourselves with help in positions where we could affect the change. Now, of course, in this political atmosphere that we're operating in now, there's so many people pushing back against that. But I believe in democracy, and I think we have the tools to counter that. It's just taking some time. And the fact that we have the resolution of so many people, black, white, and every other color in between, to not give up and not give in, I'm determined and believe that victory, meaning expanded democracy, will spread, and we've got to get through this period. But I really believe that. I do.
Well, I think that I was going to ask Professor Rothman as well. Without a doubt, from where I sit, that television played a big role, because you've got to have a constituency sort of to make such a dramatic break from the past as did the Warren Court. And it was a seminal moment, in America. Then we have, in contemporary times, we have cell phones and we have the social media. And so that is what the George Floyd incident did. It's because it was, our young people were so taken aback they couldn't believe it. And you think about that generation had the experience of a Barack Obama as president. They didn't know that in America you could a man would just had the gumption to put his knee on someone's neck, and everybody begging him not to do it, and think, why not? I can do this. And that's how Black Lives Matter in many ways took life because of that. But at the same time, that social media means we have a very different way of receiving information. I receive information because I'm probably in an echo chamber of people who share my thinking, whereas you have a huge swath of Americans who are in another in their own little lane, their own little corner. And so as a consequence, we're probably as polarized as we've ever been since the Civil War. So to what extent do you think the changing technology, the changing way of how we share information is impacting any effort around achieving parity with race and law, using the law? As you said, the historians are very unnerved by the fact that people don't want to know what that history is.
I'm always reticent to talk about the 20th century or the present, because those aren't really my areas of expertise. Like, I'm a 19th century historian, and that's what I know. I know best. And I was afraid you were going to ask me about the Warren Court. I was going to say it's not my century. But here again, I think I can't predict, how social media will transform the way people think about race or justice in the United States. But I think we actually can look back to history to try to understand some of the ways that technological change reshapes society in ways that are both destabilizing and potentially liberating. Because the first half of the 19th century was also an era of tremendous technological change with new forms of what you might call social media. I think most people are familiar with inventions like the railroad or the steamship that revolutionized transportation. But this is also the era of the invention of the telegraph, which made communication instantaneous or almost instantaneous for the first time. People felt connected in ways that they had never been connected before. And some people actually worried about the consequences of the new velocity of communication, as well as corporate control of this new media. And you could make an argument that some of the transformations in the media landscape before the Civil War actually contributed to polarization and ultimately to the fracture of the nation. So that is a very sobering kind of precedent. On the other hand, the abolitionist movement, which is kind of the movement for social justice in the United States, was incredibly innovative in their use of technology and media. They had their own newspapers. They staged plays and wrote novels that got disseminated in new kinds of ways, like Uncle Tom's Cabin. And people like, I'll give you the example of Frederick Douglass, who immediately understood the power of the new technology of photography. And Douglass ends up being the most photographed man in 19th century America. And that was part of his political project of presenting a different kind of image of African Americans to the public. There's actually a wonderful exhibit about Douglass's use of media at the National Gallery now. So I guess the lesson of history is always ambivalent and complicated, but as a 19th century historian, I kind of want to say that we've been here before.
Well, I sort of wanted to explore this further, if I could, with both of you. Whatever the limitations of that 1950s America when the Warren Court emerged, there was a notion of a shared sense of who we were as Americans, even though we knew certainly, that there were differences around race, but we all got the news from the same basic networks. We tended to go to public schools. By and large, most men were drafted. So there were shared experiences that made us feel a collective sense of who we are as Americans. Now, we don't have that. And then this world of a more customized communication system where people say, well, when we're trying to do social media, no, you can't go after. Of course, some of us keep saying, what time does the program come on? And now they tell us, doesn't matter, in the time the program comes on. It's customized for maybe 100 people. How do you achieve notions of parity in an environment where we don't possibly have the same sense of shared connection?
You want to answer that? I can try. That's a difficult one because our society, we're at a point now where there's more divisiveness, more division. And I'm a certified licensed tour guide and I deal with a lot of young people. They are so disconnected. And that is the future, regretfully, to get them to put down those cell phones, pay attention to trying to go in one direction to form a sense of worth. And I ask them all kinds of questions because I'm just so committed to getting them to pay attention to their surroundings. And it is extremely hard because of the distractions. By not having conversations, by not having dinner at home and everything on the move, it creates a sustained disconnection. And my concern for the future is as we go and advance into more technologies and more diversity, not divisiveness, that we are going to be the victims of our own so-called success. And artificial intelligence can cut both ways. They can make a huge difference in terms of health, safety, longevity, all sorts of technology. but it can turn very quickly in another direction. And I'm not to be a pessimist, but I can see that artificial intelligence could be our own undoing in time if it isn't properly controlled. And many of these young people today are so caught up in it that I'm not too positive about the long-term effect of it. I really am greatly concerned. And in my own family, I'm having trouble getting the family to grasp the significance of some of our history because they're otherwise engaged. And they say, well, you've done such a great job. Well, I'm not going to be here forever. And that's the reason why I wrote the most recent book, The Quander Since 1684, An Enduring African-American Legacy, because I want to leave something in writing. And I also want the people to know that the Quander archives are partly at Moreland Spingarn Research Center, Howard University, and I'm on the board of the DC History Center, so they're over there too. So we've got to get more aware of preserving and documenting ourselves, whether it's digitally, on paper, or otherwise. The creation of archives is very critical because perhaps we'll get to a time in the fairly near future where somebody will start asking, well, what happened back in 2024? And they'll be able to find something. So that's the solution, part of it at least, as to a brighter future.
Okay.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. Thinking about all the freedom suits in the 19th century and the 18th century, the thing that they had in common for Black families was the documentary record and that will, that Claggett will you were describing, right? Who controls the documentary record? The witnesses, who has witnesses? But the documentary record is liberating potentially. The documentary record in the face of artificial intelligence and manipulation by political forces, it's the history and the documentary record that I think we need to pay attention to the most. I do want to come back to one comment about post-World War II America and the 1950s, and you said all watching the same channels and everything. I think the more I think about this, where we are today and the polarization and the media fracturing and what that means in our lives, I actually think the post-World War II America of the 50s, 60s, and potentially the 70s is an aberration in the long sweep of American history, where media has more often than that period been polarized. I mean, the reaction to Felix Quander by the Democratic white press was to call him a rascal, to disparage him, as Judge Quander mentioned. And when I was reading these newspaper articles preparing for tonight, the Democratic paper excoriates him. The Republican paper points out time and again that he is a victim of Democratic Party use of the law, that it's pure persecution. What the Democrat police officers, what law enforcement has done to Felix Quander is to try to arrest him under pretense of law. And so the competing narratives about Felix Quander are right there in the historical record of these various newspapers that Judge Quander mentioned, and are perpetuated through, they then move through the Telegraph to all the way out to Nebraska and out to Iowa and into German language papers. And this story is a competing story about Felix Quander and about Black emancipation and law. And I guess as I think about where we are today with competing narratives and political media, you know, I tend to think that the 1950s and the newspaper media and the television media in particular under the Fairness Doctrine was an aberration in American history. And I don't know if others agree, but That's my thought.
They couldn't prove that he stole the chickens, but he must be guilty of something.
Right. So they
And
go
that's
after
where
him.
it comes. And then he got into this disagreement about that. And then they said he was resisting arrest.
Right.
And that's where the fight came. And that's where he fled because they were going to give him 39 lashes. He got shot. He was in jail. His leg was swollen. They thought they might have to amputate. I never found any record that they did amputate. So the person who wanted to administer the 39 lashes showed up. Felix is in jail with a swollen leg that might be amputated. I've come to administer the 39 lashes. They wouldn't let him do it. But you just see how the misapplication offer the creation of some opportunity. Well, as I said, he must be guilty of something. So.
Well, we're going to let the audience ask questions, but I do want to say that I certainly don't disagree with you, Will, that America has always had a struggle with her contradictions. And it were not, in some ways, for Abraham Lincoln, the founding document that supposedly defines who we are would not be the Declaration of Independence. I mean, he's the one that inserted it into the Gettysburg Address. And part of the reason he did that is because he knew he couldn't use the Constitution, because the document that really was the governing law of the country was just replete with discrimination, full of oppression and denial. But in order to, give a higher moral ground to who we are, he turned to the Declaration of Independence. And so as we celebrate America 250, we reference the Declaration of Independence. And we know that this country is just full of contradictions. So I agree with you on that. And maybe we were coming off of a great high as a result of World War II, as being the sense of the collective savior of the world. And so I think that also contributed to that brief moment in American history, but it certainly wasn't a perfect time either. We will invite the audience to ask questions as well. I don't know how we're going to handle that logistically in terms of microphone, but if somebody asks a question, I can repeat the question, and we can do it that way. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Don't be shy.
Any questions or comments that you want? Yes, please. Yeah, of course.
Ro, you mentioned something about us living in a disconnected world. But the young folks think we're all connected. And in some ways we are. So I just want you to comment on those ways.
So do we live in a disconnected world? The young people think we're connected. We wonder, or at least my generation wonders, are we connected?
I think there's a certain level of naivety there where so many of the young people think we are connected. And in a way, we are connected in some ways and disconnected. And the cell phone, computer, and all the personal things that we do are sources of disconnection and the death of conversation. So that is all that adds to our disconnect. Now, yes, we're all human. We all went to maybe the group school, same church, or the same organizations. Because of that, yes, we have some connection, and that's partially true. But I think when you get to the same meetings, half the time the people are fighting over some issue. So they're in the same meeting for the same purpose of making a decision, but the divisions come in when they come together. But that's democracy. Democracy is an experiment, and it was never for sure how it was going to succeed or if it was going to succeed. But our nation was founded almost 250 years ago as an experiment, and it was a disconnected experiment at the time, because the ones who were the upper class who were writing the all men are created equal, they weren't really thinking too much about the lower class or the enslaved. And that was disconnect from the very beginning. But those same documents have turned on their head, because Thomas Jefferson, in my mind, when he said, he didn't mean it, because it didn't include women, it didn't include people of color, and if you're white and didn't own any property, you still weren't included. But turning on their heads so that we're getting there. Now, I'm just hoping that in our disconnect individually, we will still find a way to reconnect. I don't know what the remedy is going to be. That some of the threats that we're facing in our world today will hopefully be a source to coalesce and bring us back together. We have to see what's going to happen after 2024 election. And there are those, no matter what the outcome is, if a certain person is a win, he's not going to accept it. But I'm hoping that some people will begin to look at him and say, wait, we've had enough of this. We need to get us out together.
Let me ask you, Professor Rothman, because you and Will are, in the classroom. So what is your perception of young people regarding their attitude about, is there a sense of shared connection, a sense of, is it an aspirational notion of America, or how do you think they see it?
Well, I have a lot of admiration for my students. They're wonderful students, and they're very smart. They have a high degree of dedication to their coursework and to a million things that they're doing outside of class. So I have some of them they're absolutely wonderful. And I find some of them in my history classes actually really allowing the history to move them. There's currently an exhibition in the Georgetown Library of art that some of my students did in my classes, reflecting on Georgetown's history and its history of slavery. And there's some of the most poignant pieces of art I've ever seen. So I have a great deal of faith and hope in them, but they're very anxious about their future, about the future of the country, of the world. A lot of them have climate anxiety. Yeah. They don't know what the world is going to look like in 10 or 20 years. And I think that's weighing on them. But at the same time, and this kind of goes to the question of connection or disconnection. 4 years ago, is it 4 years ago now? We were in the middle of this intense experience of disconnection because of COVID, social distancing and isolation. And at that very moment, came global protests for Black lives coming out of the murder of George Floyd. So in the bleakest of moments, people do erupt together for the change that they want to see. We could talk a lot about what's happened since then, but that moment, 4 years ago, of tremendous solidarity, I think still can be inspirational.
I think so as well. We're beginning to see a growing audience when we finally decided to do it on TikTok. There's the young, and that's basically a younger audience and a real thirst for history. So I think that if you look at, for example, you have at least 45% of registered Republicans now saying that they don't trust that Biden won the last election, and 45% actually saying they would prefer an autocracy. I do not think that's in sync with what young people want. So, I mean, that notion of that this polarization that we're experiencing, I dare say it's probably something driven by people who feel they have a vested interest in the America as they see it of today, and not the America that they want of tomorrow. What is your experience in the classroom?
Well, I teach right now American constitutional history, and my students are deeply committed to justice. I think they are concerned about many of the issues that Adam raised. They have a care for people broadly, for the United States, but beyond the world. They have a desire to see justice, and I think they have a sense that they can play a role in that. They're just trying to sort through how they will play a role in the achievement of justice. But I think our students, as young people, are deeply concerned about the future, and they're concerned about what's happening around them, and they are anxious to a degree. They've just come through a pandemic that's defined their experience in late high school, and perhaps their first years of college. So they are anxious about our present circumstances for many reasons. But I suppose what I've seen most evident is this abiding and deep desire for justice. And I take heart that they are coming up in the world.
And as we talk about the role of the law, be it law through litigation, law through legislation, I sense that they're enormously frustrated. What the heck have we done? They see the climate change. You see tornadoes touching down in Maryland now. I mean, they see the turbulence in the air. So whereas people sometimes, a man just died because of such severe turbulence in the air, they see the issue of where are the guns, where they see the violence right in schools. And we can't manage to do anything about it legislatively. And then on top of that, in the 21st century, you have the Handmaid's Tale, where women have lost the right over their reproductive system. And I mean, they can't believe it. So what are we doing with the law, legislatively or in terms of the courtroom? I think they're a little impatient, which is why they're agitated about these two old men running for president. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jeff Kennedy. I'm with that. Can you describe for us the relationship? I'm doing a lot of work on and can you describe to us at the end of the 19th century the effect of after Darwin wrote Origins of Species, the protection of the favored races, that third part doesn't refer to the races that they were talking about. As we know now, of course, within that third edition, that's taken on. Can you talk about as far as the District of Columbia and Georgetown? I spent a lot of time in Georgetown studying and looking at bioethics live on the first floor here. Looking at what's going on as far as Darwin's has evolved around the subject of scientific racism and eugenics, how that affects what's going on in right now in legislation and law. I just saw recently that Ayanna Pressley, about 2 weeks ago, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, created a bill to overturn Buckner's bill 1927 sterilization law. And she did it around rights of disability, women with disabilities, and their reproductive rights. So, and of course, in the attack of overturning the Roe v. Wade, how Planned Parenthood and others use the exception for eugenics in overturning Roe v. Wade and Trump's immigration, wall, which comes directly from America's first, and the idea of keeping people separated out of this country. Can you discuss a little bit how that late 19th century, how that is what's creeping into our politics and coming back up now, especially after Brown Report, especially in this city?
So the question is about how Darwinian ideas of evolution and scientific Dalton ideas of scientific racism shaped Georgetown or discussed at Georgetown. Is that right? Eugenic ideas. And the honest answer is I don't know. It's a great question. I promise to look into it. But I don't know what the curriculum was like in the late 19th century, and I don't know what they were teaching in the medical school, for example, or in the philosophy department.
Well, around racial inferiority.
Yeah.
We were racially inferior.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I do not know what they were teaching at Georgetown at that time, but I can imagine. And one of the reasons why I can imagine is because of what I know about the culture of Georgetown in the late 19th century. And the fact is that in the late 19th century, Georgetown was a Jim Crow white supremacist institution. And there's a very, if you would indulge me, a story that some
Please.
of you some of you here might know. In the 1870s, Georgetown's president was a Jesuit priest named Patrick Healy. Let's see, how many
I
of you
figured you were
raise your
going to
hand
go
if you've heard
there.
of Patrick Healy.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of you. So Healy was born into slavery. His mother was an enslaved woman who lived just outside of Macon, Georgia. And his father was an Irish immigrant cotton planter who owned his mother. Those two, Healy's parents had several children together. Michael Healy, the father, recognized his paternity to the children. He sent them to Catholic schools in the North to be educated and emancipated. And several of them went on to have quite illustrious careers, including Patrick Healy, who became a Jesuit priest, earned his PhD in Europe, and came back to serve as president of Georgetown from the mid-1770s to the early 1880s. So just before the time you're talking about. But although the Jesuits knew his ancestry, they kept it a secret. They kept it quiet. Because the only way that Patrick Healy could have been president of Georgetown at that time was essentially to pass for white.
Right.
Which is what he did. This is the same moment that Georgetown is adopting its school colors as blue and gray to signify the reconciliation of white students from the North and the South. So this is all happening at the same time. And this is why I say Georgetown is essentially, despite Patrick Healy's becoming president, is essentially a Jim Crow white supremacist institution. And it is likely that what they're teaching at the school flows from that culture. And just to make one more point, the first black student was not admitted to Georgetown until 1950. 1950, this moment of post-World War II desegregation. So we've done a lot of research on Georgetown's history before emancipation, and now we need to pay attention to what happened after.
Understanding, could be wrong, that first almost by force from the government because he couldn't qualify for a certain status. I don't remember, it was a secret clearance or something. And Georgetown was the place that offered that. So they, whatever it was, Department of State or somewhere said, you must take this student. Still not really integrated. They took a student. So that wouldn't constitute integration. I went to John Carroll. I mentioned before this. When we were in high school, I went there. And we learned very quickly at John Carroll, when Georgetown came to interview students about going to Georgetown, they recruited visibly around us. I don't know if they thought we were stupid, but we saw it. We knew what was happening. And in his book, I Came as a Shadow. They didn't want me because I was black. And then he says, wanted me because I was black. So yes, they did integrate, but it was an arm-twisting situation. That's also why today in Catholic circles, we identify Augustus Tolton, who's a candidate for sainthood in the Catholic Church. We refer to him Augustus Tolton, the first recognized black priest in the United States. And that's because the Catholic Church is saying they know Healy was passing. but we have to get to do. Yeah.
Well, that's a very compelling question you asked, though. And, I think that Isabel Wilkerson, who is a native of Washington, I think she did the best job I've seen of explaining this racial caste system that I think affects everybody. It doesn't just affect, white supremacists. Unfortunately, everybody sort of absorbs that to some extent. And that's what makes it such an invidious dynamic, and God bless the law if it does something about it. Do we have any other questions? Joy? Okay.
So I want to ask Bill a question. And I'm always mesmerized when Judge Quander talks about his ancestors and their courage in confronting the law. But Bill, I was wondering, as you prepare this archive, what other cases are coming to that are your
Sure.
research and investigation?
Yes. So the question was, what other cases am I researching and writing about and working on and that are in the archives about Washington, D.C. and about freedom suits in particular, like the Quander families? The short answer is that there are dozens and dozens and hundreds of freedom suits in Washington, D.C. We've collected these from the National Archives and put them online at earlywashingtondc.org. And you'll find there more than 500 freedom suits that enslaved families in Washington and Maryland, mostly Prince George's County, filed in the 19th century, and some in the late 18th century. And so there's more than 500 freedom suits on that digital collection, and we're always finding more. In fact, the colonial freedom suits, including the one by Margaret Quander, I think that's right.
Well, let's look a little bit. That particular one is where in 1702, there was a tax that they were putting on slave women. And Henry Quander, Margaret, his wife, went to court to say, this does not apply to her. She's free. And the court just ignored it and said, you better pay the tax anyway. And it goes on to say he paid the tax. It was under protest, but he was seeking to establish his right and her right as a free woman. Right. And that's one of the cases that shows us they may have lost the battle, but we're on our way to winning.
So one of the families that I've researched is the Bell family, and the Bell family here in Washington, D.C. filed at least 8 major freedom suits. One went to the Supreme Court by James Ash. He was a Bell family member. And the Bell's freedom suits eventually sputter in the D.C. courts. And despite their extraordinary legal efforts, their documents, their family stories, their freedom by manumission and by will in several cases, despite all of that evidence, in a crucial case, the jury decides against them, and they're out of options. And Daniel and Mary Bell essentially lead the Pearl escape of 77 enslaved people out of Washington, D.C. in April 1848 on a schooner called the Pearl, and sail out of Washington, D.C. with several white abolitionists who are helping them. And the Pearl is recaptured in the lower Potomac. Many of you may know this story. It's an important Washington, D.C. Moment in history and in the history of freedom in the United States and the claim to freedom. What many people may not know is that prior to the Pearl escape, the Bell family had sued for freedom. The reason that they work with white abolitionists and contact white abolitionists to arrange for the Pearl escape is that their freedom suits had finally, in the very end, been unsuccessful for Mary Bell and her children. And so the Bell family is the largest family on board the Pearl. 11 members of the Bell family out of the 77 total are on the Pearl. And so these families, like the Bells, like the Quanders, the Queens, Edward Queen, who we mentioned at the outset, and Mina Queen, who sues in DC, and Priscilla Queen, who is on the Pearl with her daughter, Harriet Queen. So here's a family, the Queen family, who sued for freedom in 1791, as Professor Rothman mentioned, in Maryland, in Annapolis. Dozens win their freedom in the Maryland courts. Despite that, they are still having to sue for freedom in Washington, D.C., still some of them enslaved, seeking freedom through the law, sue on the basis of those earlier Maryland cases. But when the D.C. court eventually rules all of that evidence out of inadmissible because it was all hearsay, they eventually, like the Bells, are on the Pearl as well. And so Priscilla Queen, certainly a Queen descendant, is on board that ship, attempting to escape in 1848. So there are many families and all in the DC area that have brought these cases and continued to use the law in this way.
Must be very frustrating. Right here, and then I know we're running out of time, so we sort of should make that the last one. Did you have an observation you wanted to make? Go ahead, please.
I'm thinking about the younger generation. I agree that was a reaction I had thought I had as I was listening to President Rowe. And, they believe they are connected. And in fact, those that are considered Gen Xers, millennials, really did leverage social media to connect, to develop what we now know as civil protests. After George Floyd. So it's just I mean, it's so complex and layered and such an interesting dynamic, but it has democratized in many ways access to information, obviously, we know that. And so that's an important benefit, and I think students feel liberated by that, but they also feel overwhelmed by that. I too am in the classroom, so it's a lot of information coming to them, and so that contributes to that anxiety. What the future holds in the environment. But so I found that interesting. We have different points of reference of what is appropriate interactions, right? Information. And so for young people, it's very appropriate for them to connect through social media, and that is how, it's the way. But then I think it was a point that you raised also, like as well, that the primary sources, and making sure, as teachers, we know students don't always get your message the first few times you say it. But if we put the information in, special places for them to find when they're ready, I think that's so important for us, that we make it available to them. And that the facts are there to compete with whatever the false AI. There was a report that came out today that, several of the language platforms are putting out false information. More times, it's like the average of 27% of the information that they're putting out around the election is false. Simple things like when the date of the election, right? So we put the information, I think, in an archive or in places where they can access it when they're ready, so that it can also balance out the false information.
I think the legacy of too many people who are living today will be the only thing they left were emails, and they were erased.
That's why we have to put it out and, put it in archives like you said. That's very important.
So as we close this out, do you want to close it out? Help us close it out, Will, in terms of your sense of where we're going as a society. I take it that you and Adam are optimistic about this new generation, their sense of wanting justice. So there's a shared sense of that here, which is good. But do you think that it'll become even more robust with this generation? With this generation, I keep forgetting to hold the mic.
Yeah, I do, and I want to come back to the last comment, which I appreciate so much, because what you said is that we have to meet students where they are when they're ready, and having archival information, having these stories, having this history available, accessible, reachable for students, and reliable, that it's been really preserved in this way and circulated reliably for students. That's what we're trying to do with this Mellon project, and to include the stories of descendants of people engaged with this justice movement, who are participating in storytelling to try to make this history available and accessible and be ready for the students and for young people when they're ready to see it, and when they encounter it. And there's nothing more important, I think, for historians than having our students really work with the original record rather than a filtered, distilled sort of story that they can't, if they can get their fingers on and their hands on these original materials, they engage with it in a very different way. And so meeting them where they are is what we hope we'll do with the U.S. Law and Race Initiative, to be able to make it possible for teachers and students to really engage with this history in a way that's not very possible in some settings around the United States.
How about you, Ro? What do you think?
I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. And I would like to mention, because I think it's appropriate here, we have a series of organizations that have been founded fairly recently for the purpose of going back to those original documents. And in the Quander family, and there are others, Syphaxes and many others too, we have established the League of Descendants of the Mount Vernon Enslaved. And the purpose of it is to help document, identify, document, protect, and share as much as we possibly can the oral histories, and in some cases the records that are written that have been passed down through generations of formerly enslaved people, to understand in this Law and Race Initiative that the underclass, our ancestors who ran the plantations, who did everything there. The story is to be able to say that George Washington could go off and be George Washington crossing the Delaware in an overloaded boat on Christmas night, because the enslaved kept the home fires burning from construction of the site and everything relative. And they have similar organizations at Montpelier, which is James Madison's, Monticello, Thomas Jefferson, and other, because our goal is to do as much as we can to capture the original thoughts of those who are our forebears, because that is the underpinning of our story as we go forward. Yeah.
What do you think, Adam? What do you think, Adam?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate this last point as well. And I think we can do a few things. One is make the original archival materials digitally accessible to our students. We're in a world a world of historical scholarship that's really being revolutionized by the digitization of primary sources. But it is actually, there's almost too much out there. It is kind of overwhelming, and students do need some guidance as to how to navigate that landscape. So that is something that we can help with. The second thing I think we need to do is be more creative in our storytelling based on those archives. I say this because in some ways, like the story of Georgetown's history was never a secret. People have been writing about it for a very long time. But when we started investigating it at Georgetown in 2015, most people around the university had no idea that any of this had ever happened. So we need to do a better job telling the history that we actually know. And I think actually Will's work here is really exemplary. He didn't mention it, but he's part of a very creative team that has been producing animated films based on these freedom suits. And they are amazing. And they are a way of appreciating and understanding history in a totally new kind of way. And I think that we've all got to collaborate to do more of that kind of thing, because that's the way we're going to get these stories told.
Well, it's been a great panel. I just want to say as a footnote that those of us at the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History have also come to appreciate the sobering and comforting quality of history. In other words, you feel, okay, these are such horrible times and they're polarizing, and how could they say those horrible things about the president? And so when you read what they said about Abraham Lincoln, this is a cakewalk. I mean, they called him every kind of thing you want to think of, and even that he wasn't even human. I mean, they questioned whether he had evolved from being an ape to being really human. And this man is catapulted into a semi-deity status. Why? In part because he was the first American president to be assassinated. And I find it interesting that it happened on Good Friday. Appomattox occurs on Palm Sunday. The fatal wound occurs on Good Friday, and the country gathers to mourn when? On Easter. That is part of the extraordinary coincidence or providence of his death, and how we then embraced what he tried to get us to embrace, our better angels and our notion of ourselves as Americans. So history can be very comforting. We are learning the hard way as well, how to put that history out in a way that is more accessible, more interesting. One thing is, don't go on too long. It can be 60 seconds or less, and you got a better shot at reaching your audience.
That's hard for us.
Hard to do. I know. You don't ask a lawyer to do it. So, so at any rate, I think what Will is doing, and the contribution that, of course, just your family, Ro, and then, of course, Adam, what they're doing at Georgetown University, and the way you animate that history about Georgetown and the role of the Jesuits in the evolution of this city and on these critical issues is very intriguing, very engaging. So I want to thank our audience, and always thank the University of the District of Columbia for their confidence and support in what we're doing here at IPPH. So, and to our virtual audience, good night.